we were so concerned about the impact of policies put in place since September 11th on immigrants, that we actually wrote a report called Securing Our Borders, the Post 9/11 Scapegoating of Immigrants, and the impact that many of these new programs and policies and strategies that have been put in place to strengthen our borders and control immigration. Instead, I believe that what they've done is made us less safe. They've undermined our fundamental liberties, and frankly, they've destroyed families. Let's talk about the federal level for a minute. We've got all kinds of operations going on, like Operation Endgame. Operation Endgame was put in place in the summer of 2003. It's a 10-year plan for immigration officials to arrest, detain, and deport 400,000 immigrants. Operation Return to Sender. That's an operation whose goal is for each of the fugitive operation teams, fugitive ops teams, to catch 1,000 immigrants. And they've been very successful. In fiscal year 07, they actually arrested 30,500 immigrants, almost double that of the previous year. Florida was the #2 state in terms of increased enforcement activity. Now, if you're riding a train or a bus, you're not safe either. Border Patrol agents routinely board these trains and these buses, and we hear complaint after complaint of racial profiling. Let me give you a couple of ideas of what's been happening in Florida. Condo that I'm referencing had about 70% Brazilian tenancy. And this is what this was in October 07, this is what the condo president posted as a notice. She said, "I'm requesting that Immigration and Customs Enforcement come into our building and do a door-to-door documentation of everyone's legal status in this country. If you do not make yourselves available with your documentation, I will allow authorities to do whatever they deem necessary, including forcible entry into the unit." But the good news is, a week later, she was no longer condo president, but a couple of families actually moved out because they did not want to be living in that kind of environment. Poor young Honduran woman. It was a traffic stop in Miami around Christmas of last year. The car ahead of them had been stopped for a traffic violation, and then their vehicle was stopped, even though they weren't even issued a traffic citation. She was there with the father of her 2 children, aged 5 and 7. Immigration told me to say goodbye to my husband and kids. My smallest child was crying and screaming to be with me. They handcuffed me with metal handcuffs. My children were clearly terrified. I had no more time to explain what was going on to them. That was the last time I saw my husband. That was when we saw her 2 months later. I spent 15 days at the Broward Transitional Center. I couldn't get any information from anyone about anything. My family also didn't know where my children were. After about 15 days at the Broward jail, I was told I was going to be transferred to Texas. Now, this woman had no criminal history, never even had a traffic ticket. I asked why I was being moved there, and an officer told me I would probably be deported. I felt like I was going to die. I said, I cannot go without my children. I was in Texas jails for about 1 month. I was in 2 different jails near the border. I begged for a phone number for where my children were. Immigration in Texas told me they had nothing to do with operations in Miami. They said they had no idea where my children were, and they couldn't call Miami to find out. I couldn't understand why no one cared. I couldn't eat or sleep. I lost a lot of weight. Finally, immigration arrived and said I had to go back to Miami because I had a hearing with a judge about my children. I had gone almost 2 months with absolutely no information about my children. I finally saw them for the first time on February 14, 2007. When I saw them, we all started crying. My children also had no information about me or their father since our arrest. They didn't know my husband was deported to Honduras. My eldest son asked why I and his father had abandoned him. He asked me why they were with strange people and not with me or his honor or his father. She had told police immigration when she was arrested that she had a lawful permanent resident sister who lived in Texas, and could the children please go with her. They said her children, they said they woke up every morning crying for me and their dad. My youngest son was having nightmares that I went to Honduras and left them alone here. My children think I'm a criminal because I can't leave the Broward jail. They saw that the men outside were wearing orange uniforms and it scares them. My eldest son asked me if I had killed somebody to get here. About a week ago, immigration told me if I didn't get them the original social security cards and birth certificates for my children, they would remove me without them. Now remember, she's in detention, right? I am confused about the entire process for my children. I was glad to see FIAC, that's an Immigrant Advocacy Center, because I haven't been able to afford to hire an immigration attorney. FIAC said there was a court hearing with a children's judge about my boy's case and who has custody of them, but immigration never informed me of the hearing at all, and we just came upon this woman when she was back at the Broward jail. Immigration threatened that I would never see my children again because I couldn't enter the United States for 10 years. They told me my kids might end up permanently in foster care in the United States after I was deported. I'm not even fighting to stay here. I'm just fighting for my children and my family to be together. But I felt like I was being punished for a horrible crime. I'm not a criminal. To suddenly tear us apart and not tell them where I am and where their father is, and not to tell me where my children are for 2 months, I think this is a great injustice. A great injustice indeed.
About 40% of these immigrants have come here only in the last 5 years, and about 2/3 of them come only in the last 10 years. It's an incredibly intense phenomenon. If you look at the low-wage sector of our economy, 21% of the workforce today is foreign-born. If you look at the low-skilled aspect of our labor market today, about 45% of our labor market today is foreign-born. Low wage is defined as occupations where the wage is less than double the federal minimum wage. Low skilled is defined as a job which requires less than a high school diploma. The way our federal structure is built, most of the taxes go to the federal government, but most of the benefits that immigrants derive actually come from the local governments. So the federal government actually takes much more in taxes than it gives in services, and states give much more services out than it takes in taxes. I think the second other important thing was undocumented immigrants. Obviously, those who work on the books pay the same taxes as everyone else, but they're eligible for almost no public benefit other than basic public education and emergency medical care. Immigrants typically are very young people. They contribute to the social security system for decades without getting any benefits out of it. And when they become eligible, many of them are not even in the country.
I heard recently about a town in Riverside, New Jersey, where they passed a bunch of very anti-immigrant local laws with the idea that they didn't want to have undocumented immigrants there, so they're going to push them all out. It turned out that the business community quickly rallied around the idea that this was a terrible idea, and they reversed all the laws because what they saw was Main Street shuttered up, and there were real dramatic, obvious problems. The foreign-born population contributes to almost a quarter of the New York State economy. It's exactly in line with its numbers in the overall population. So in other words, I think that in New York, that there's often this sense that immigrants are basically low-wage workers, or at least they're more concentrated on the low-wage. And this really says they're not in New York. And it may be different in other states and in the country as a whole, but in New York they are absolutely, contributing, pulling their weight as much and even a little bit more. So here's New York City. 37% of the population is foreign-born. 45%, so almost half of the workforce, is foreign-born. I'm sorry, 46% of the labor force, 45% of the working-age population. And again, 37% of wage and salary income. In other words, immigrants are making basically about the same amount. One thing that is pretty striking about immigration to New York is it's very, very diverse. Much more diverse than in a lot of other cities. If you look at different states, we have the states where New York has the most diversity of region of where immigrants are coming from, what countries are they coming from. You have to go through 12 of the top countries of origin before you get to even 50% of the immigrants. Kids are growing up in families with immigrant adults, and I think it's pretty striking to see how many kids are growing up in families with at least one immigrant adult. In upstate, where there's 5% of the population is immigrants, it's 8% of kids. In the downstate suburbs, where it's 18% of immigrants, it's 31% of kids. And in New York City, where 37% of the population is immigrants, 57% of kids are growing up in families with at least one immigrant adult. So I think, we can think about what's the implication of the kind of stuff that we say, what's the public discourse like, and what's the impact on kids. And I also think, what is the future going to look like? I don't think there's really any choice. One way or the other, we have to figure out how this is going to work.